Today, we're going to explore a powerful question. What happens when we redefine who gets to lead? So there's diversity, maybe someone that doesn't look like you or think like you, but they're the right person for the job. My guest today is Michael Durnil. With deep experience across education, philanthropy, and diverse communities, Michael brings a unique perspective on leadership, on systems, and expanding of who gets to sit at the table. He's accomplished executive with Cooper Coleman, a firm that partners with nonprofits and foundations to find executives, but with a human-centered approach. If you've ever wondered how leaders can evolve to be better and to reflect better those that they serve, this conversation is for you. Get ready. Michael's here to tell us what works. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Marla. And I'm so thrilled to be able to chat with you about this because it is a passionate subject for me. As you've mentioned, I've had a very sort of, I wouldn't say checkered, but a very divergent career and been able to do a lot of different things in the course of my own personal career. And it was because people allowed me, right? And I think that's part of why I'm doing what I do now as executive search, because I want to help give back to the sector, because it is better when we begin to think about different leadership strategies, different leadership types, different leadership people, and have different people with different opinions at the table, quite frankly. It really is about making sure, especially in a hiring situation of a board hiring a CEO or a CEO hiring senior leaders, it's about helping them get strategically aligned to be able to accept someone who is not necessarily their picture of an ideal, right? I've worked with boards who've said, we want this, this, and this, and this in a checklist. And I'm like, okay, that's nice. Do I add that they walk on water and ride a white horse as part of this job description, And they kind of then get what I'm talking about. And I have to let them know that if they do want, it's often a claim of diversity. Great. If it is that, they have to understand that the people that they might be looking for may not meet all these experiences because they've never been allowed to have those experiences, right? Part of the challenge is when sometimes an organization, a board wants someone who's had previous CEO experience or ED experience. That's the hard conversation. Not everybody is allowed to hold that seat. And that sometimes is shocking to the people that I talk to. But once I walk them through it, they begin to realize and really encourage them to think about transferable skills, different kinds of access to information, different kinds of even experiences, and how that may align with what they're looking for.
So it really is that not only like knowing what the skill set needs to be, what is teachable and what is just inherent gifts and personalities and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was even common in my world, even as a nonprofit, the complexity of diversity even, or the complexity of experience versus aptitude.
Mm-hmm.
What is like that core nugget thing that makes you passionate about really finding the right person?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things, right? I grew up in a family where altruism was a high value to us and taught to us, which I didn't even realize actually till I was working on my Ph.D. But it was because of where we lived. I grew up as another. We were different than the community that we lived in, but I got away with passing. Quite frankly. And then when I was working in higher education and I thought ready to take on a senior leadership role as a president of a university or a college, I started doing interviews. And this was in the early 2000s. And I remember very vividly getting off a plane and thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not as white as these people thought I am. I'm not as straight as these people thought I am. I'm not as conservative as these people thought I am. And I knew immediately, even though before I started the 2.5-day interview, that I was never going to be a match there. And it was a shame. And a lot of that time, even back in the 2000s, we were talking about diversity in the terms of ethnicity or even skin color, quite frankly. We weren't talking about differently abled. We weren't talking about women leadership. We weren't talking about any of those kinds of things. And so I left higher ed actually after that and began working then in the philanthropic sector and not-for-profit sector full time. So those two things, growing up the way I did and the research that I did for my dissertation, which was about cultural advocacy, And then that experience combined really lit the fire in me. I understood I had a challenging time. I thought everybody did until I started talking and seeing other people who weren't and would get promotions, would get appointments. And I have to bite my tongue because I just don't know how that works, right? As I ascended the levels in higher education or philanthropy, I began to see how it works. And it's my responsibility to be at this table to change these conversations because the world is changing and the organization has to change along. To be effective, to be sustainable, to have efficacy, they have to have at least a diversity of opinions starting there. That's like the baseline. And then going to these other kinds of representations or engagements or even experiences, and realize that people have a lot of different ones of those in one package. And that's even helping candidates often understand that. Since I've started doing executive search, I've done some research on my own. And that most candidates who do not click every box in a job description will never apply. So that leaves out automatically sometimes mostly women. And then also as you look at non-majority groups. So organizations who want us to work with underserved and underrepresented often want staff who look like they're serving, but they also say, but we can only have somebody who's served as an ED. And so I have some difficult conversations sometimes with some of the clients to help them begin to process and think about. And, there's always a question behind the question. Well, why do you want this? Why do you want that? Is that really what they need? Do they have to have had this, little box of experience, or would you look at it this way? So that gets me up in the morning and keeps me going.
It's interesting. It didn't even occur to me when we started this, but your negotiation skills and your communication skills with the board really starts well before you even start doing the searches. And
Absolutely.
and not only understanding, but aligning them with reality a little bit.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And it's about translating too. That's the other thing that I learned when I was a CEO of a not-for-profit. My staff would talk in one set of language. I would talk in a different, and then my board members would talk in yet another one, as well as our stakeholders. So the CEO role or any of the C-suite roles within a not-for-profit, I don't care how big or how small, you have to learn to translate up and down and have some facility and being facile at that, just to make sure that everybody does get aligned around whatever that you're going to do.
I think that's a really important point because so often for people to function where they're supposed to function, they do have a certain vantage point, language, culture, and to be able to bridge what's needed to be bridged, the agility of an executive director or a C-suite leader, that's a really good point. I want to, before we move forward, a question I had in mind as you were talking is, what would you say, or how do you explain a consequence for not having diversity on your team?
For me, it really goes to starting looking at the mission of what that organization is supposed to do. And then find points within that mission, which everybody's agreed on, vision, mission, right? They've all agreed on that if they're on the board, if they're on the staff at some level, and tracing back through that mission to help them understand where there has to be diverse points of view to bring that mission forward or to let that mission evolve and grow and excel. I work with a volunteer organization here where former EDs and C-suite leaders volunteer back into not-for-profits and help them. And I was working with one where we were working through some issues, and all of a sudden a board member's like, they were serving unhoused and homeless people and people transitioning out of hospital care. And they're like, none of us have ever had that experience. We only know what we think is right. We've never really had a client or a stakeholder who uses the services even be at a board meeting, so I was like, that's a wonderful breakthrough for them to begin to understand that not everybody has the answer. This is very funny, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying it, but I won't tell his name. I'm working on a production right now. I do community theater, and we were having a conversation the other day about something, and the director said to me, he goes, I finally realized, he's a white cis male. He's like, I finally realized not everything's built for me. I was like, I am so proud of you for coming to that conclusion, and I will take responsibility for shaking up your life that way. But it was great, and he was very genuine. And to me, I had to be careful because I was almost going to make a joke out of it, but he was very sincere that he had had this revelation that not everything was geared towards him.
Wow. It's interesting. I was an operations leader for North Africa, Middle East, and Central Asia, and then later just for Central Asia. I asked the question even before I was named, could a woman do this job?
Mhm.
Not because of skill set, but because of being accepted.
Right.
And a guy from Egypt's like, they're so lucky. I wish I could be on your team. And with someone from Central Asia, I was called Madam Dictator for 2, 3 years, and simply because of my gender. It's an interesting thing where when you step into not looking like someone, or is this made for me? Wait a minute. You almost have to take off your deserving coat and say, I want this for everybody. And it might look different. It might feel uncomfortable even,
Hmm.
because it doesn't cater fully to that. How has your community working in the theater, how has that affected even what you do in light of finding people?
As an actor trying to get cast, I'm always trying to make sure that I can align with whatever the director's vision is. Sometimes it's very narrow, sometimes it's very broad. So you have to get used to no's. And helping candidates that I work with, I have to be very upfront with them. If I'm doing a search, I may have as many as 100, 150 candidates. And one of the conversations I have up front with them is, not everybody's going to get this job. There's only going to be one successful candidate. But that doesn't mean that we can't work together to make you be as packaged, as presented, as polished as a successful candidate. So I love that part of it too, working with candidates who are applying for jobs, because on more than one occasion, I've worked with candidates who've impressed the heck out of me, didn't get the job for a lot of different reasons, but boy, the next time something comes along, I'm able to tap into them and say, hey, I have this. So back to the theater, you're asked to stretch, you're asked to do things. You have to go through things a lot, rehearsal, before you get to the performance. And I think that just what you were talking about, it made me think about, a lot of times leaders have to take on, and it's exhausting, I get it, the responsibility to connect the dots for everybody else of why you're in that seat. It's hard enough just as an ED, but when you begin putting those other frames around you, or what people perceive as frames around you, it gets exhausting. And I understand that. But I think that bringing people along with you in that journey is terribly important. I had a supervisor once who said, it's great to be a leader, but you got to turn around every now and then and make sure people are following you. So that has always stuck with me, right? Yeah, it's always stuck with me.
I know. You look back and you're like, am I leading? Am I not leading?
And where are they going?
Yeah, come on, come back. Kind of, I was thinking about the gap between the hiring gap of needing people translating to just a leadership gap. Once someone gets into a leadership role, especially where it's a stretch hire, right? They maybe haven't had the experience. Where do you see them struggle the most?
Yeah, I think so. It is making the assumption that I can't ask for help or I can't ask for support. And part of my role, and I think we're unique in this as a search firm, we follow our place candidates over the course of their first year. We also provide very specific onboarding advice to our client about how to make that candidate successful, and help them anticipate those conversations that they need to have with their candidate. Because candidates, they've got the job, they've got a lot of work ahead of them, and the first thing they're afraid to do is look not prepared, or underprepared, or not have the skill set day one. I think the biggest issue, especially in groups that are not normal to whatever that role is, they forget to ask and actually raise their hand when they need that support of the board.
Do you see different cultures, or do you see a difference depending on culture?
I do. I don't mean to stereotype, but I do think that there are, within cultures, there are ways to talk, to be respectful of people in authority, that spill over even when you are that person in an authority, right? And I think there's regional differences too. And understanding that, I once had a job where I had responsibilities on the West Coast and the East Coast. I'm more oriented to the East Coast. I wasn't as well liked, accepted, or respected on the West Coast, just because the way I worked was terribly different. And it wasn't part of the culture, right? So that was a hard lesson for me to learn, is like, wait, what? We're all in this together, aren't we? Well, yes and no.
What do you suggest that
Yeah.
helps a team accept new people, especially that are different from them?
It's interesting about how many boards, they're busy, they're all volunteers, they've got a million things going, but sometimes they just need a checklist of like, make sure the new person's computer is on their desk, make sure they have a phone number, make sure they have a business card, whatever, it is. And people are like, oh, because they often come from very large corporations or their own success. And there's always somebody else who takes care of that. It doesn't occur to them that they have to be the leader in that. And that message sends a welcome. So that's part of the conversation I always have with boards is, executive leaders make a decision about their tenure at the organization within the first 3 to 12 weeks, whether they're going to, not just if they're going to stay that contract, it's whether they're going to stay there, period. And so it's thinking through that. Well, if this person's different, how do we manage different than what the ideal was, or maybe even what the staff wants? The other thing that we do, I guess I should say too, is important is whenever we're doing a search for a senior leader, we also involve some of the staff in what we call a discovery phase, where we go in and like, what are you looking for? Who are you looking for? Describe to me, what skills do they have to have? What skills would be nice to have? What's the one thing I don't know about your organization that you need to tell me as I do this, right? So getting staff buy-in, at least through that process, is terribly important to us as an organization. And I help boards understand why that's important too, because you always have a board every now and then who wants to hire an executive leader with no input from the staff for whatever reason. But that's also not going to be a long-term successful lead, no matter their skill set.
Yeah, that's just paramount. In fact, a episode just went out a couple weeks ago about the importance of onboarding, but I hadn't thought about onboarding the executive director. I wanted to highlight what you said, that within the first 8 to 12 weeks,
Sure.
they've
Yeah.
decided their tenure. If you think about how, well, you would know, it's like the intensity of doing the search, the money, the time, the energy, and then to almost throw it away by not doing onboarding well or team building well. It's like throwing out the best after doing the hard work.
Right. Well, and I think we're also in a period of time where that message is almost lost, quite frankly, because investment in a search is expensive. Some search firms charge somewhere between 30 and 40% of the first year salary of an organization to do that. Because there's such a crisis in employment right now, there are so many people who are out of work, often by no circumstances of their own, just
Right.
shift funding for especially in DEI programs across the country. All of that is happening. Boards often assume that there is just this wealth of candidates and all they have to do is post and pray to get the right one. I understand that mentality, but it is the search is an investment in the future. And I encourage people to look at it besides the cost of what the search is. What's the unintended consequences, especially if you're hiring somebody who has to be responsible for fundraising, stakeholder engagement, all of that. A mishire can set you way farther back than taking the time and investing in a thoughtful process to get a new hire, really at any level, and especially at the C-suite and above, because you've lost the time. You've probably ticked off some people in the process because you just never responded to their application. You've probably upset your staff by not listening to them or putting in the wrong person. There's just a million things that can go wrong. And I'm not saying search is perfect, right? We all have our lumps and challenges, but at least you have outside expertise to help you as a board or as a CEO to navigate all of that and have somebody to bounce all those ideas off of. So you're not doing it in a vacuum either.
Yeah, that sounds really important. This is such a volatile time. Yeah, have you seen an uptake of like maybe more talent out there because of what's been going on in the world?
So yes, there's a lot more talent out there. And just as I mentioned, people have lost jobs, but there's still that old mindset of like, oh, they've been out of work for 3 months, 6 months, a year. I don't know if they're going to be, but it's like, let's look at the reasons. And I used to have to fight this with women returning to the workforce. They've been raising a family. They have no budget skills. You don't think budgeting or balancing a paycheck or single family paycheck is not budgeting? You got another thing coming. But it's that old mindset of like, oh my gosh. And well, why have they been out of work? Why haven't they found a job? I'm sure people listening to this will have been in the job market and they know how dehumanizing it is as a candidate. And that's one of the reasons our principal started the firm, was to sort of break the mold and be a disruptor to that, because it's important for everybody to feel very positive about that. And again, going back to that speech about not everybody's going to get hired, but I want you leaving feeling very positive about this organization. You may be a future donor. You may come back again at some point in time, or you may like the organization so much you look at other options. But it's that misconception that just because somebody isn't currently working, they're a bad candidate is just makes me a little bit nuts.
Yeah, it's something that stood out to me last time we talked is that you said that a lot of candidates send you a thank you note even when they didn't get the job,
Right.
right? It's one thing if they did. What do you do different in the process that allows people to want to do that?
Well, I think we invest a lot of time. And for me personally, I've sat on what I say all three sides of the search table, right? I've been a candidate, I've been someone hiring, I'm working on executive search now. And I think I have the empathy to understand what goes on. There's no person doing the research for me. There's no somebody who, we've all had those interviews where you look up on Zoom and the person interviewing is like just finished college maybe, and they're asking you these questions, and you ask them a clarifying question, they're like, I don't know, I've got this question in front of me, just answer it. So I think that one of the things that I do, and I like to work with candidates is to help them understand how to present themselves on paper, how to present themselves on LinkedIn. It's so funny. There are so many people who don't even have a contact email address on LinkedIn. And I'm like, and you're
Huh.
looking for a job? How's somebody going to find you? Let's talk through that. But it's common. And, just understanding how to play. And everybody thinks that your cover letter and your resume get you the job. That's not true. That gets your foot in the door, right? And one of the things we do differently, until the candidate has been through a couple of rounds of interviews with us, we don't even require a cover letter. We let them know what they're applying for so that they can begin finding out and figuring out why they are the best candidate and connect those dots. We've all applied for those jobs where you have to have a cover letter, reference letters, your resume, your birth certificate, your mother's maiden name, you have to give all that stuff.
Exactly.
And you don't know, you really don't know what you're applying for. So I think that's one of the things that we do differently. I try to, I hate making those calls, letting someone know that they're not part of the process. I try to give as much feedback as I can of why or why not. And sometimes it often just comes down to the fact that it's not about the candidate. It's about
Yeah.
the organization. And walking through people that and having the time to do that, I think is terribly important. We've all gotten those form emails. Thank you. We've had an overwhelming amount of applications into our process and blah, blah, blah. The other thing that I do is any candidate that I speak to once, I continue to speak to by phone, or at least try to reach them by phone, just to have that personal touch in a way that is transformational for them, because they've been through all this other nonsense where they've clicked on LinkedIn and the tile says, you're now 347 who clicked this apply button. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
and it's just words, right? There's no
mhm.
human contact. So I love that idea of, I can even tell how you're saying it, that you're treating them with dignity, you're treating them like a person, talking to someone on the phone versus just a automated letter.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's so rare that people feel seen and heard or in respected in the hiring process?
I think candidates are vulnerable. Whether you're in a job or out of a job, there's so much that goes on behind that. If you're the primary paycheck for a family, you feel this huge responsibility that now you're out of work, your health care. There's so many factors on that I think people look at those again, going back to that thought of post and pray. Well, there's a lot of people looking for jobs. Yeah, but everybody has a story. And I think if I can help people know that they've been seen and I've heard their story and I've listened to their story and what they've told me helps me recruit better for the organization I'm working for, because I know the backstory. I can sit at a table and have a very cogent conversation with the hiring authorities. But, I think we are in a world where everything's a blur, right? Everything happens so quickly. Everything goes by so
Yeah.
fast. People are like, well, wait a minute. Hello, I'm over here. They just don't want to be a number. They don't want to be searched by an automatic, personnel system. They don't want to make sure that they've had to go to AI and put every keyword into their resume just to get not flagged, right? So I think that it goes back to the personal touch, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto you. I know how it felt. And I think that people just really amid all the crisis that they're going through or why they're applying for a job, there is that vulnerability, and acknowledging that I think is terribly important.
I so agree. Thank you for doing it that way. I think the one of my top values is kindness,
Mhm.
and it's a mistrade, especially as we become more social media and mechanical, and so the human touch will always hit someone. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, it made me laugh when we were talking about the East Coast, West Coast thing. Somebody, when I was going through that, and this is an overgeneralization, said, people on the East Coast will not smile, but they will be very kind to you. People on the West Coast will smile at you and not be very kind. So I was like, gross generalization, but I get it. I get what you're meaning. And so it is interesting about how you are your own self brought up, and how you
Yeah,
value kindness, and clarity is another one, and helping people understand where things stand. What did Kissinger say? The politics, well, that was in higher ed. The politics in the higher ed are so high because the stakes are so low. I think that people get so wrapped up in some of these things, especially people inside the organization, that often adopt the posture of like, well, any candidate should be happy that we even looked at their resume. Wrong. Candidates are savvy anymore too. They're also evaluating the organization as much as you're evaluating them. And I think sometimes organizations forget that.
that's a really, really good point because you need that good fit. And there's a lot of people you don't want to work for because their philosophies, how they treat people. And so even being treated this way at this level would hopefully translate into that.
I think that clients who hire us specifically value that and understand that. And that's one of the things we look at too, is if we are going to bid for a job or put a proposal in, is it an organization we feel good about working with too?
What do you wish that a client would understand about leadership even before they started a search?
For an ED or C-suite position, I think that there's a bit of alchemy that has to happen within leadership, and it is understanding again that nobody's going to check all those boxes. The opportunity is to make your challenge the organization, the client, to prioritize those boxes, and then find as many people with those skills, but how did they fit into that, almost like a right. The other thing, which is very scary to clients, is if they don't find the right candidate, don't hire them out of desperation. I think that there's sometimes that happens, and then again,
Yes.
that's a lose-lose, right? You put somebody in a position and then provide them no support, and then you throw your hands up 3 months later and go, well, how did we get here? It is a slow process. Right now, we're taking anywhere between 12 and 18 weeks to find the right people to get them seated. Organizations
Wow.
are usually at a crisis because they have no strategy around succession planning. That's another thing we always talk about too, is that leaders will up and leave, and then you're like, now what do we do? Well, you should have thought about that maybe as soon as they started, because that's the other challenge.
It's a really important. I actually am very glad that you brought that up because having the wrong person is much worse than not having a person.
Correct.
It's just mission critical. It kind of goes a little bit with the onboarding piece too, right?
Mhm.
Because you could have the right person, not onboard them right, and then they become the wrong person. But the desperation or the almost maybe flippant, like maybe anybody can do this job. What makes a wrong person or what would make a wrong fit?
I think a mismatch on mission is really a good place to start. And often when new leaders are hired, there's a lot of discussion about change. People on both sides of that equation forget to define what change is. There's often
Yep.
a leadership board that will say, now it's time for change, and we've got to change the strategic direction, or we have to evolve. And those are the words they use. Someone eager to have that position agrees, yes, 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 we can do all of that. But they forget to talk about what change is and what that
Yeah.
looks like, how it manifests itself, and what's sacred, what's not. As a new leader, you hear the words, oh, they want change. Okay, I'm coming in. And even if it's incremental, there can still be missteps in that, just because it's not been a clear discussion across both areas about what that change looks like. Even at the incremental levels.
So, so true. And I want to underline what you said too, as we were talking about. A lot of times people are panicked about getting a leader because the former one left. They'd probably been thinking about it for 2 years, but they said it and they left. I did an interview with Bert. He started with, I'm transitioning out and I've been planning this, and it was just such an emphasis of planning. What would you say, as you're seeing this, of people who, of the board and the CEO planning the transition to a new leader before the old one leaves? How does that fit? Is that common to have it planned? Is it more people just up and leaving?
So I think there's a couple of things. Long-seated executives care about the legacy that they're going to leave. So I see that the actual executive in the seat is often the one leading that discussion with the board, feeling a responsibility to do that. And the boards like look at someone and go, oh yeah, they've been here 20 years. They're not going to continue forever, right? So let's begin thinking about what that looks like. I think smart boards begin thinking about it. Is there someone internally that could be elevated to that position, trained, mentored in those last periods of time between the exiting executive director and the incoming? But I think it's more often than not that boards are like, oh, everything's fine. Isn't everything wonderful? They haven't checked in. They haven't had those conversations. And I see that often with people who are sort of mid-career, who are interested in exploring further responsibilities, bigger expectations, bigger organizations. And the board just thinks, oh, everything's fine. I know personally of a situation that happened where someone had been in an organization for 12 years. They hadn't been equitably paid, even in the regionality where they were working. They worked very, very hard to prove themselves. They provided all the documentation. Didn't even ask for 100% of comparable. They were like at 64 and they asked over 4 years to get to 80%. Begrudgingly, it got drug out by the board. Meanwhile, the sitting person started looking at other places. They're like, it's the communication of it doesn't value. Now, the board be thinking, well, we've got to think about it, strategize, blah, blah, blah. But there was never that communication back and forth between the two parties. So the executive director left. I do know that this person had left extensive succession planning documents, but the board went into turmoil and the position sat open for over 8 months before they hired somebody else. And now I think that organization is already on their second or third ED since that person who had been there 12 years left.
That would be an interesting case study, right? Like I interview a lot of leaders who have taken over from another leader that was messy and, they were in debt, wrong people on the bus and stuff like that. It's interesting to see, but really a board of directors who says, you work your hardest you want and we won't have your back. People at that level, when you have the capacity of a C-suite, and it means there's some kind of not only talent, intelligence, but ambition too. And younger people might not stay for 30 years or whatever. And so I think that's a really important piece of it. You've said it, communication, like really keep those communications open. What does it look like to value both?
Yeah, and I think it's a misconception that high performers don't need high support. And I think that high performers often need higher levels of support from a board or a supervisor than someone who isn't necessarily as high as a performer. But, we spent, what's the role? 80% of your time are spent with 20% of the challenges that you have.
Yeah.
I think that there has to be the recognition that, high performers have very high expectations of their board too, and very high expectations of how they get support. And again, it goes back to the communication. If the executive isn't communicating to the board, who do you hold responsible? Well, part of it is, can the board ask those questions too? And the other thing, you were talking about turnover of people, not only at the executive level, the world has changed dramatically. Younger people in the workforce don't have the loyalty, don't seem to care, and don't feel like they have to stay at somewhere 2 years, 3 years, 4 years before moving on. So you do get people who move out of a full-time position, maybe go to gig work till they feel happier doing what they're doing, and then want to re-enter. And then you get the people who are like, well, they can't keep a job. They've had 4 jobs in the last. Well, it's not that they can't keep it. They've had choices. They've made choices. And again, it's getting to the why of all that. That's often the challenge for anybody in in that conversation.
Yeah, you really do need to understand the motivation. Yeah, I
Hmm.
have a younger person in my life. Yeah, you've kept the job a long time. It's been 3 months. And I'm like, it's just a different world. And it's the world we're in. It's the social media, but that needs to be taken in account. And also, there is cost in turnover.
Hmm.
There's,
Huge cost.
the not only the training piece of it, the finding piece of it, but the knowledge transfer. When I resigned from my role after 36 years, so I gave longer than 3 months. But the thing I heard over and over again is, how are you going to transfer your knowledge? It's vast, and it was with multiple countries and multiple leaders and turnover. It's almost like turnover's expensive,
Hmm.
and also, we have a younger generation that doesn't seem to have that loyalty. So I think that makes it even more important for companies and organizations to have the healthiest, most fulfilling work environment
Yeah.
possible.
I think young people do have loyalty. They just define it 100 times differently than I do and how I was socialized into the world of work, right? And I think you got to understand that. And again, make sure you're providing those opportunities where they see that upward mobility. Now, often they see it in titles and dollars, which don't happen in the first 3 months. But,
Right.
as you build that culture within your organization, ways I've seen colleagues and friends and people be effective is helping people find opportunities to build their own capacity within the roles that they're filling and where they go. I laugh. I go back to the very first question you asked me, and I don't know why I didn't think about saying this, but one of the ways that how I got seen or how I got felt valued is I began taking on the jobs that nobody else wanted to do within an organization. I would take them on. If I failed, at least I tried when nobody else had
Yeah.
tried. And if I got something good, I got that recognition. And I think people often see like, you're dumping work on me, you're giving me the garbage. I saw it as an opportunity. So it's reframing those things too. And that's, I think, is another one of the ways and why I feel so passionate about the work that I do is that I understand that not all the work is glamorous and not all the work is linear and not all the experiences are linear, but they do help you build your capacity and skill sets and buckets that you can carry forward with wherever you're going.
I love that. That shows a work ethic and an attitude that makes everything just healthier.
Yeah.
So in closing, I want to ask if organizations truly want to get the best person to lead, what advice would you give them?
I think they have to throw all the expectations they have on what that person looks like and the career path that they've had to get there out the door. They just really have to set that aside and be open to understanding that even in today's world of work, things are not linear. People don't ascend by checking off every boxes. They don't have to be in an organization 25 years to have moved through, served their dues. That with the mobility and the change in just even the geographic mobility of people, the change in the way in which people view their life and the balance of their life, they are leading different lives to ascend the corporate or not for profit or the executive leadership ladder. They're living different lives than if I was a board member would look at the person that we're hiring. So it is wrapping up those expectations in a nice little box, setting them aside, go into it with an open mind.
That's well said. Do you have a spirit about you that you can tell you care for people, and I
Yeah.
love that. It's in many ways rare.
Yeah.
So
Well, it is, it's very funny. Sometimes people, when I was still interviewing in the world, people would ask me things like, how do you know you're a good supervisor? I would say, well, I have relationships with almost every person I've ever supervised in the course of my career. I still have contact with them at some level, not only who I supervise, but my colleagues. And so I think that is just kind of a testament to what I value and how I keep in touch with people. So that's sort of how I would judge my success,
yeah,
is making sure I've left the place better for somebody else and that they're thriving. We know that 100% of our candidates have met or exceeded their guarantee. We guarantee our placements. We know that 93% of our appointments or searches that we've led have been resulted in people from underrepresented groups getting hired. And so, you know, that's the space we're trying to try to define ourselves is making sure that if somebody truly wants a diverse search, we're the firm to do that.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know. Michael, thank you so much for our time together.
Marla, I've enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to What Works with Marla Moody. Until next time, keep leading with clarity, developing your team, and discover what works.